Well, I'm glad you're here tonight. I know there are a lot of things that you could do on a Thursday night, and it means a lot that you are here to join us. And what we are going to do is go through some of this, and you might wonder, is there going to be a time for question and answers? Yes, there will be. And again, we recognize we're dealing with something that sometimes can be a little bit controversial, but certainly we're going to try to go through that and give you a chance to respond. If you notice all this equipment up here, we have an opportunity for those of you online watching on Facebook, but Parker has done a very good job also of making some really good video and audio clips of this, which we'll put up afterwards. So if you run into somebody who said, I really couldn't understand it very well with what was on Facebook, we will post something that will look even better. And also, I might just mention that one of the things I've done is already done a podcast on this. So even if you go onto your phone tonight and say, I want a refresher tomorrow when I'm working out or I'm jogging, that podcast already exists. And you have some material on the table. And I also am going to talk about some digital material we have on the website probe.org. So is that pretty good? I think we've given you a lot of information here. Let's start out with a couple of real quick disclaimers, and that is when you talk about the woke agenda, that is huge. And so even when we talk about tonight what will be kind of woke theology, that's still larger than we cover in one session. So as I put on the screen there, I fully expect during the question and answer period, you didn't cover such and such. I've left as much off as I've put on there, but I think you'll still find that very helpful. And part of it is when you talk about woke agenda, some of it has to do with such things as gender, sexual orientation, and the rest. And so I put on the screen, Sue Boland covered that last time that we did one of these presentations. So by definition, I'm going to look at some of the other things, but if you find yourself saying, well, I was hoping you'd also talk about a gender confusion and gender identity and transgenderism, I'll mention a little bit about that, but we've had an entire presentation before that Sue did, and I want you to feel free during the question and answer period to ask any question, including, it seems to me, everybody's asking questions this way about Ukraine. So it doesn't even have to stay on topic. And we're going to have a few people with microphones walking around here to give you a chance to ask some questions. Okay, when we talk about woke, that's a phrase that is used and, quite frankly, sometimes misused. And so one of the books that we will mention at the end by Owen Strachan, Christianity and Wokeness, I appreciate that because in his book, he said, let's, if I can, create a list of what woke is not, because sometimes it's misused. You know, wanting social harmony across various religious and racial backgrounds, that doesn't make you woke. Seeing some of the failings in our history, in American history and Western history, and some of the patterns of racist thought, you know, again, that we understand that. Doing everything you can to try to build bonds with other individuals, reach out for racial reconciliation, again, that's not woke. Even praying for more diversity in your church, you know, and wanting to reach out to others, that's not woke. And even wanting greater justice. As we go through this, we're going to talk about the fact that we recognize there's injustice in this world, and the question is, what do we do? So with that, what is woke then? Well, it's kind of a mindset and a perspective. I've had more than a few people, even in my Sunday school class, come up and say, what does woke mean? Well, it's really the idea that you're awake to the true nature of society, that you recognize that this is maybe a very significantly, systemically racist society, and the way in which oftentimes that is communicated is through critical race theory. Hence the reason I gave you one of these booklets, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, but I'm going to go beyond that. But why do I call it woke theology? For two reasons. First of all, when I interact with non-Christians, sometimes on a campus or even just in the corporate world, woke theology has almost become kind of a substitute religion. It sort of has a view, it sort of has an eschatology, it has certain things that are said, certain things that are not said. It all, in some respects, almost is, for a non-Christian, a substitute religion. Now, some of you here may be non-Christians. You say, well, it's not a religion for me. I understand that, but I do use that to illustrate the point. But the second reason is because if you have not seen some of the battles within Christianity right now, over this issue of woke theology, I'll try to educate you there, because there are battles within churches about this issue, battles within denominations. The other day I was seeing a battle in a Christian school, a Christian college, and so in some respects we want to try to give you some information. Recognize that everybody here has their opinion, and you're welcome to your opinion, but you're not welcome to your own facts. And I want to try to put some facts out there that maybe you've not heard before. Matter of fact, I have a whole collection of some of the books that we've mentioned, but a lot of what I'm going to share are things that I've gleaned just from my own personal experience, but I'll also point you to some books about that as well. When you look at this chart, you can see, we see all sorts of lines, the white privilege and LGBTQ and intersectionality and white privilege and all those. And so I wanted to focus on one aspect for a few minutes. It's going to be a history class, won't be long. And if you hated history, I'm hopefully trying to give you some basic information. But what is this idea of critical race theory? Because it has been bandied around quite a bit. I think it was instrumental in an election that took place in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I think it's certainly part of some of the debates that have been taking place in school boards. So let me just give you kind of a real brief history. And if you think to yourself, well, I want to learn a little bit more, that's why I give you a free booklet there. And it also has some for further reading at the end. So where did this idea of critical theory come from? Well, it turns out that it really comes ultimately from what is called the Frankfurt School. University of Frankfurt Institute of Social Research was one that was in Germany, but many of the professors, as the Nazis rose to power, left and came to Columbia University's Teachers College and developed what's called critical theory. Now, this is different than your typical kind of Marxism, because in classical Marxism, you usually look at class. You have the workers, the proletariat, and then you have the owners, the bourgeoisie. And Marx, and I studied Karl Marx and read Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Mao when I was in graduate school at Georgetown, would actually say that this class struggle would lead to socialism and eventually to communism. The reality is it didn't really happen that way, and so this is why other theorists began to say that instead of looking at class as a victim, we would look at other areas, race, gender, even sexual orientation. And so as a result, critical theory, you could have critical race theory, you have critical gender theory. Sue kind of alluded to that last time we were together, and so that is really what critical theory is all about. Well, it's been something that's been used in the universities for some time, but the person that really kind of gave it an opportunity to make a difference was a Professor Derek Bell, who was at Harvard Law School and then later began to be the dean of the University of Oregon Law School. And so it traces all sorts of injustice and inequities and inequalities down to such issues as class and race and sexual orientation. And the argument is we need to be awake. We need to be woke to the fact that there is systemic problems that need to be addressed. So in some respects, when people say it's not Marxism, I would agree. It's not classical Marxism, but it's a form of what we call cultural Marxism. And we've interviewed individuals, for example, on Point of View that have gone into great detail talking about what cultural Marxism might be. But the idea here is that eventually you would move through these various institutions. That's a phrase used by Antonio Gramsci. Well, that's more of the history than probably you wanted to know, but I wanted you to know that it does have a historical background. Now, one of the things I find so interesting, especially in a lot of these debates, is that there are a lot of euphemisms. For example, when this was first kind of raised in Loudoun County, Virginia, and even more recently in the Carroll School District just down the road from us, lots of times they'd say, well, we're not teaching critical race theory, we're just teaching culturally responsive education. Well, it turns out that's one of the euphemisms for that as well. It talks about equity. Now, you might say, well, I believe in equality. No, equity is different than equality. It talks about social justice, diversity, and inclusion. Now, those words alone don't necessarily mean critical race theory, but I put up this cartoon. Nothing called CRT, critical race theory, is being taught. Yeah, but ban educational programs that teach that individuals of any race, ethnicity, color, or national origin are inherently superior or inferior wouldn't fit. You're starting to recognize that some of these ideas are showing up in the school districts. And I've said before that when, yesterday was, if you remember, March 16th, 2020. What started that day? 15 days to stop the spread or to slow the spread. Remember that? And what I began to say that, the pandemic caused a lot of people to say, I could not have told you who my county judge is. They can probably tell you who their county judge is now. Because of some of this teaching, there are a lot of people that say, I couldn't tell you who's on our school board, but a lot of people are starting to pay attention to who is on their school board now. But what's the idea of critical race theory? Basically, it's kind of a binary idea. Either you're in power or you're out of power. If you're in power, you're automatically discredited. If you're out of power or underprivileged, you're basically immune from criticism. One of our former probe staff members, Doug Groteis, was on the program a while back, and he said, think about this. What they are saying is if you're underprivileged, you can make demands, but you don't have to make any arguments. Because after all, the argument that they make is that the whole system is corrupt. Systemic racism runs all the way through this, so I don't need to even try to use rational arguments because, after all, the system itself is flawed, and as a result, we've got to transcend that. And so ultimately, it means that the claims of critical race theory are unfalsifiable. Now, up until this point, let me just say, I do believe that some of the inequality that exists in our country and even in our society sometimes is due to racial attitudes and stereotypes. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But I disagree with the idea that all of it is due to that. And as soon as you start trying to say, some of that might be due to addictions, lack of two-parent homes, all sorts of structural issues, lack of educational opportunity, that's when people say, then you've already, in a sense, proven that you are just part of the white supremacy that exists in the first place. And so one of the ways in which people have tried to push against this is to use the idea of white fragility. Now, as I go through this, I won't quote all of the various authors in this case, but Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility. It was a New York Times bestseller, in which he says that sometimes white fragility is the defensive response by a white person when you talk about whiteness, or the response of a white person who then becomes defensive when questioned about race or improper attitudes. And as a result, her argument is that if you become defensive, that just shows you're part of the system. And what I think is happening is you fall into what I call the Kafka Trap. And what I want to do is give you some tools for the discussion that maybe you would have with other individuals. First of all, what in the world is the Kafka Trap? Well, it's a very interesting use of kind of linguistic word twisting and linguistic arm twisting, probably a better way to say it. And the social justice warrior will oftentimes simply say, when you say you're not a racist, that just proves you're a racist. And the idea comes from Kafka, who wrote The Trial. And in that totalitarian world, this individual is arrested and accused of a crime, and he protested that he was not guilty of the crime, and the state argued that because he claimed that he was innocent, that proved that he was guilty. You with me on this? Well, that's the Kafka Trap, because what you'll see is kind of a verbal sleight of hand. If you admit to being a racist, then you're a racist. But if you claim that you're not a racist or you don't have racial ideas, it's also a racist. You're a racist either way. It's a classic example of what we call the Kafka Trap. The thought police in our society theoretically have rigged the system. It's a heads I win, tails you lose. Do you see where we're going with that? And so I think that's one of the things to pay attention to. And there are some people that have written about that. One of those is Greg Kokel, who's a very good friend of Probe Ministries. In his book, Tactics, he has a section on this. But I think he's updating it because he's seen how this argument is being used in the racial areas. If you've noticed, and you were maybe here when we had Sue, we talked about this idea that we have a little bit of an interesting contradiction with the word binary. Because on the one hand, we're being told that if indeed we are said that, they're just male and female, as Sue pointed out before, people say, no, I don't believe that it's just only male and female. Matter of fact, I've met a number of people that say I'm non-binary. So they say there are many different genders, not just male or female. On the other hand, they actually insist that race is binary. Either you're a victim or you're an oppressor. And I see a little bit of a contradiction there because, again, the argument only goes one way. For example, you could never say, nor should you say, all black people are fill in the blank. But oftentimes, a lot of these individuals that I interact with will say, all white people are fill in the blank. You see how the game is played sometimes linguistically. And so I wanted you to understand that sometimes when you have a discussion, it kind of tends to heat up. Sometimes it's hard to have a discussion with people you disagree with, but at the same time, I wanted you to notice some of the things happening in the background. But James Lindsay is an individual that I've quoted before. He actually helps us show that this idea of critical race theory really is quite impractical. He says, imagine you own a small tailor shop where you have to assist each customer individually. Two people enter the store simultaneously. One is white and one is black. If you choose to serve the black person first, well, that proves that you're racist, because you don't believe that I could allow a black person to be in the store because they might steal something. So it proves for sure that you're racist. But if you choose to serve the white person first, well, that shows you're racist because you believe in their superiority. You know, I have June Hunt here, and one of the things we talk about sometimes in counseling is what they call negative interpretation. One of the things that will destroy your marriage and destroy a relationship is negative interpretation, in which whatever you do, your motive is assumed to be what? Negative. And that's what's going on here. I mean, heads I win, tails I lose. I mean, you just think that through because that's kind of the mindset, and it's also kind of looking at people's motivation. And we recognize that I think it's really difficult sometimes to sort out people's motivation, but this is, again, something that I've noticed beginning to unfold on this idea of critical race theory. Okay, smart guy, then how are we going to address this issue of race, and how are we going to work for racial reconciliation? By the way, there is a book that just literally came out, and I thought it would be worth mentioning now, and it comes from our good friend Tony Evans. And it's called Oneness, and it is full of really good, concrete ideas about how to deal with race and racial reconciliation. Did an interview with him briefly at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and I'm going to try to do an hour with him as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But how do we deal with these issues? And the first thing I think we need to come back to is science. Ray was nice enough to mention I do have a science degree, so let's talk about that for just a minute. And you know, if you look at the Human Genome Project, dividing by race doesn't make a lot of sense now biologically. I mean, when Charles Darwin was talking about race, we didn't know genetics. He had never met Gregor Mendel, didn't know all of that, but we know a lot more now. And as a result, we recognize that the things that differentiate us, this is mostly a white audience, but I've got a few people here that are African American as well. But even in here, that's very small diversity. If you were to take the widest diversity you can imagine, maybe Australian Aborigine and somebody from Norway, you first recognize that people from every race can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If you remember Biology 101, okay, that tells you pretty much all that you need to know. And some studies have said that if you took this DNA of any two people in the world, and I'm trying to imagine the most different people in the world, they would only differ by about 0.2%. And even that is not significant because only about 6% of that is due to racial categories. So all the things that we think are really significant really aren't. The racial differences really are trivial from a biological point of view when you recognize that we have 3 billion base pairs in the human genome. So that's just from a genetic point of view, but think about it from a social point of view. I oftentimes, in our booklet that we have on racism, which I'm going to make available to you digitally if you'd like, also point out, what about Tiger Woods, for example? It just illustrates a good example. Because if you're not familiar, Tiger Woods is 1/4 Thai, 1/4 Chinese, 1/4 white, 1/8 black, 1/8 Native American. Most of you probably filled out your census. He could check every box: Asian American, Anglo-American, African American, Native American. In other words, because of interracial marriages, these diversities are even beginning to fade away. Think of our Vice President, Kamala Harris, same kind of thing. We're seeing more and more race is even less significant from a biological or social point of view. But what about a biblical point of view? Because I think most of you in the room here are probably Christians. And that is, first of all, the Bible only talks about one race. the human race. These superficial differences in skin color and hair texture and eye shape and all the rest really are not a justification for treating people differently. And there has been racism for a long time, and I think even in Greece, there was probably this idea that the Greeks were the chosen people and everybody else was a barbarian. The Romans used to talk about those who were barbarians. And what does Paul say when he's in Mars Hill in the Areopagus? That we're all of what? One blood. All go back to what? Adam and Eve. So whether you look at it from a scientific point of view, a social point of view, or most importantly from a biblical point of view, dividing people by race really doesn't make a great deal of sense. With that as background then, do we have racial issues in this country? Now, I'm pulling quite a bit from my book, a booklet on racism, which is available to you, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But I do see a real division in America. One of the things that we have been doing at Pro Ministries is we've had a survey, and as a matter of fact, as you go to our website, you're going to see that we have been doing a very extensive survey of Generation Y and Generation Z. But we've also been looking at all sorts of other surveys. On our staff, Steve Cable has looked at the GSS surveys, he's looked at the Barna surveys, he's looked at the Lifeway surveys, he's looked at Pew surveys and all the rest. But let me just give you 2 slides on that. The Pew Research Center found very significant differences between black adults and white adults. More than 7 of African Americans believe that race relations in the U.S. are generally bad, and yet you could only find about 56% of whites that agree with that statement. So a little bit of a difference there. But even more so, they found that 3/4 of black Americans believe that the country hasn't gone far enough in giving blacks equal rights with whites, compared to only maybe about 1/3 of whites. And perhaps the most discouraging part of that survey, almost half of the African Americans convinced that black people will never have equal rights, which I think is really a sad commentary indeed, but an illustration again of some of the racial division that we need to address. That's Pew survey. The good news is we have Barna Research. George Barna started it. Now he's separate from that. And so various people that are part of the Barna Research now, Dave Kinnaman and others, have also found some interesting disparities. For example, more than 8 in 10 blacks believe that people of color are often put at a social disadvantage because of race, while a bare majority of evangelicals agree with that. So sometimes we in the evangelical world say, oh, we feel like it's pretty good. Not what the general population thinks. And they found a similar thing in terms of the so-called reverse racism or affirmative action. And when we talk about racial stereotypes, this is in this booklet that we could make available to you, we find all sorts of things, and I give you lots of examples, but I'll just pick out one. They found in one study that people with a black-sounding name had to send out about 50% more job applications than people with white-sounding names just in order to get a return call. So lots of times people say, well, I'm not racist yet, but when it comes to who you're going to hire, sometimes that's the case. And we see that black college graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed as whites. So do we have some work to do? Yes, we do. By the way, I might just point out that even this survey, as people looked at it, said, we're not so sure the choice was being made on the basis of race as much as it was based on the idea of class. Would that person fit into an investment company or something of that nature? I'm not justifying it. I'm just simply saying sometimes which is pointed to as race, when people go back and look at it again and say, well, maybe it isn't so much race after all. And that's something to think about in some of these academic studies. And so obviously we need to address some of those issues. And I think it might be time to maybe talk about one of those. We in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex have a very significant issue, and it's called food deserts. You know what those are? Food deserts are when you look at different zip codes, and I've looked at the map for the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. What you find is that there are certain zip codes where there is no grocery store within that zip code. And this is oftentimes the primary example used to point to systemic racism in the Dallas area. The other day when I did an interview with Jim Dennison, many of you know him, he quoted it. The other day when I brought it up in our staff meetings, one of the individuals quoted it. So I thought for just a minute, we might help you understand how this is an issue that needs to be addressed. but also show you how critical race theory doesn't make it better. It actually, in some cases, takes a problem and makes it worse. Well, let's think about this for just a minute. First of all, if you wanted to have a grocery store, you're going to, of course, have to convince a major grocery chain to actually locate a grocery store in that particular zip code. Not exactly easy, because after all, I've looked at those zip codes that have a food desert, and a lot of them are not minority districts. Matter of fact, we've got a couple of our board members. Matter of fact, we've got 3 of our 4 board members here today. The only one that's not here is actually the mayor of Aledo. And in Aledo, they don't have a grocery store there. And if you've been following the Dallas Morning News, they're talking about putting a grocery store in Forney, H-E-B. By the way, this has been an ongoing debate about how difficult it has been to try to get a grocery store in there, even though they own the land. But nevertheless, I thought I would take you through some of the things that the Dallas Morning News have been talking about, and to their credit, the Dallas City Council. First of all, you got to convince one of these grocery stores to actually have a grocery store there. It's Kroger, Albertsons, Walmart, whatever. I've checked it out. The cost is about $15 million. No small investment in putting a grocery store in that zip code. And in case you're not familiar, those of you that have ever been in the grocery business, about 1 to 2% margin. Suzanne and I, when we lived in Dallas, the Albertsons next to us went out of business. Then we moved to Plano, and the Albertsons there went out of business. I don't know if it's us or whatever, but anyway, grocery stores, it's a tough business. Okay, so first of all, you got to convince them to get the land, which they have now in Forney, but again, in South Dallas, West Dallas, wherever you want to put this, then you start running into all the moral objections. The first one you run into from critical race theories is with this. Well, these white-owned grocery stores are moving into black neighborhoods to take even more money out of the community. Well, maybe you can fight that one off a little bit, but then the next one is a very real issue, because if a grocery store moves in, what they've had in the past are some of these local convenience stores, right? And those local convenience stores are owned by what? Hispanic American, African American, sometimes Asian American individuals. And so then you have this, they're actually taking jobs away from them. So you can see all of a sudden you're starting to run into some really significant battles. Once you get your grocery store up, you have to have a significant amount of security. Now again, you might say, well, that's a racist comment. No, it's just an observation. I go to 2 different Krogers. I go to one by my home. I go to another one very close to our radio studio, which is a place which is pretty close to a high crime area. When I go to the grocery store in my home, occasionally I see law enforcement. When I go to the one by a radio studio, I always see someone in law enforcement. Why could that be? Well, it could be, I don't know, a district attorney that says we're not going to punish anybody that steals less than $1,000 of resources. So you see the kind of question that a grocery store chain is going to start asking. And then once you get it established, you got another issue. And that is kind of education a little bit, because the education is going to be very important as well, because people have not been eating fruits and vegetables, so you're going to want to encourage them to eat nutritiously. But you can see how that could very easily, from a critical race theory, be saying you're just trying to force your white ideas about nutrition onto those. You start seeing the level. This is what the Dallas City Council ran into, just a harsh reality of how difficult trying to solve that problem might be. Okay, so do you have an answer? Yes, work with faith-based organizations that can help out. Urban Alternative, the Voice of Hope, and all sorts of others. For those of us in the room that are familiar with Prestonwood, they have a thing called Bridge Builders that works in the Bonton community. I have some friends here from Northwest Bible Church, and guess what? We have the Northwest Community Center in Vickery Meadow. And one of the reasons we do this is because I've sat on the board for a number of years of West Dallas Community School. That would not have been successful if we did not have Arvil Wilson, who was the pastor at that time of West Dallas Community Church, as kind of the person in the community to alleviate some of the possible charges that would come about white people coming into the neighborhood. Are you with me with that? And so it seems to me that this, if we're going to be successful, requires a partnership. And I wanted to at least talk about some of the people that have been very involved in doing that. And I just wanted you to see that in some cases, this kind of bias and this always assuming the worst motivation is not helpful. It's actually, in some cases, something that is quite divisive. Okay, I just had to also spend some time talking about white privilege. Ever heard about white privilege? Let's talk about white privilege for just a minute. Where's the idea come from? Well, it comes from Peggy McIntosh. She was a professor at Wellesley College back in 1988. Remember that date, because it's going to be important in just a minute. And she was really kind of a feminist who was talking about male privilege. And we recognize that is the case. I mean, tonight, if you're going to a parking lot and you're a man, you probably feel a lot more comfortable than if you are a woman. I understand that. And there are privileges to male. Well, she started writing about male privilege and white privilege. And he argued that just as men don't understand their male privilege, white people don't understand their white privilege. And so that is certainly the case. But notice the date, 1988, third of a century ago. And so she actually listed about 24 plus examples of white privilege. And I thought I'd put a few of them on the table and let you look at those. And the first of those that I have there is I can turn on the television or open the front page of a newspaper and see people of my race widely represented. And that may have been true in 1988, but I was thinking it's not quite as true now. Have we made some progress in that regard? I don't know how many of you watch WFA, Channel 8, but you have, for example, Chris Lawrence and Joe Trahan that are African American, and you have Cynthia Isigera, and she is Hispanic American. Matter of fact, I think the only white guy there is Pete Delkus, the weatherman, right? You might say, well, that's recent. Oh, no, before that, we had John McKay, we had Gloria Campos. Some of you have been around a long time might remember Iola Johnson. So the point I'm making is not that this isn't an issue, but that have we made some progress? That's the thing that sometimes people in critical race theory won't always mention. Or if I want to, I can be pretty sure of finding a publisher for this piece on white privilege. I would suggest to you now that, again, the people that sometimes are given the greatest opportunity are women or minorities. And if you are part of intersectionality, if you're a black, a lesbian woman, boy, you've got a real chance to get published because of just the desire for diversity. I can take a job with affirmative action employer without having my coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of race. Well, that's faded a little bit. I mean, we don't really have presidents that suggest that they would put somebody on the Supreme Court because they're black women or anything like that anymore. But, you know, that I think has been a turn in the wrong direction, but we'll leave it as it is. I love this one. I can choose blemish cover or bandages and flesh cover and have them more or less match my skin. You mean like these dark bandages right here? I mean, again, I'm not trying to minimize this. But I am saying sometimes there's an unwillingness to admit that there is some progress made in America. But what do we think about this idea of white privilege? I would commend to you, if you want to tonight, watch the video by Brandon Tatum. This is one of the PragerU videos in which he talks about white privilege. And he says, you know, I agree, there is white privilege. There's also born in America privilege, born of two parents privilege, all sorts of other things. And I began to think about that because, you know, born in America privilege. There are billions of people on this planet, almost 8 billion people on this planet, and they would gladly trade places with you right now. Because if you make the average income in America, you're kind of in the 1%. Remember when Occupy Wall Street said, well, we are upset about the 1%. I used to say people that were a part of that, no, actually you're part of the 1%. If you've traveled to third world countries, you know how much we have an incredible blessing by being in America. Clean water privilege. You know, my daughter lately has gone to Tanzania twice now because the company she's with takes their profits and they drill water wells. Where do you get your water? You turn on a spigot. Where do they get their water? From the rivers, which are just horrific, until they drill some of those water wells. Born to two-parent privilege, you know, that gives you a head start. Now, some of you didn't maybe have two parents, but just think of the privileges that some of us have that go even beyond this idea of white privilege. Access to advanced medicine privilege. Everybody here looks pretty healthy. You know, I only know one person in this room that has ever had polio. You know, I don't think anybody in this room has ever had smallpox. I had a grandfather that I wish before he died we kept track of the number of kids he buried that died of whooping cough and diphtheria and cholera and pneumonia and all sorts of things. And, we're a pretty healthy bunch, even though we have had an incredible pandemic. How about high school diploma privilege? My mother only went through about 1 or 2 years of high school. Most of us in this room have a high school degree. I imagine most of you even probably have a college degree. Think of that kind of privilege, or the technology privilege that we have as well. So how do we respond to that? I want to say, yeah, there's white privilege, and I think we accept that, and we should understand that. But there's a lot of other privilege. And so part of the problem is the way critical race theory looks at this is they use this philosophical concept of thrownness. Nobody's written on this, so this is my idea. Let's see if you agree with it. The existentialists talk about the fact that we are just thrown into our world. You're born rich or tall or poor, tall or short, white or black or brown, Asian, and you think of the Doors, riders in the storm, riders in the storm. Into this house we're born, into this world we're thrown like a dog without a bone. That's the existentialist idea that we just, are a result of mass energy, chance, and time. Is that a Christian view? Don't think so. This biblical idea of God's sovereignty, of God's calling. You want some verses for it? I don't know. How about Esther? What does they say to her? Who knows whether you may have come to this kingdom for such a time as this? And it seems to me that there's only a couple of ways you can respond. The critical race theory, individuals say, well, you confess your privilege and then just feel guilty about it the rest of your life. Well, that's a possibility, but I just sort of reject that. Or maybe you accept your privilege and develop a superiority attitude. As Ray pointed out, I've gone to some elite universities. I've met some people that are so arrogant you just want to not do anything, but you're tempted to. Just go, I just can't believe that. I got a better idea. How about we acknowledge our privilege and recognize that God made you the way that you are? Why am I tall? Don't know. Why do I have a voice that most people like to listen to? Don't know. But am I going to then waste that? When I was tall, I played basketball. With this voice, people hear me on the radio. I've got a pretty good brain, so I use that on the radio. But I've seen a lot of those people, that superiority attitude, that just simply spent it on themselves. It seems to me that a biblical idea, instead of actually feeling guilty about that, we should maybe feel what? Gratitude. To whom much was given, of him much will be required. In humility, count others more significant as yourself. Just think of the verses that talk about gratitude. I would suggest to you that critical race theory wants to make you feel guilty. I got a better idea. Why don't you recognize the gifts God has given to you and have what? Gratitude. First Chronicles, give thanks to the Lord for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Sue pointed out the other day, one of the examples in Romans 1 about a culture sliding downhill is what? A culture that did not what? Honor God or thank him. Maybe instead we should thank God for this incredible privilege that most of us in this room have, rather than be made to feel guilty. Rejoice always, continue to give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with what? Thanksgiving. Let your requests be known to God. So let me wind down here with a couple of quick points. Then encourage you to maybe pick up some of the material there, and then we're going to let you ask some questions. I'm a talk show host, used to people asking questions. I've been in universities where people will shout me down, so I'm ready for whatever you want to offer. But let's, for a minute, say, okay, how do we think about these issues? Because if you've been paying attention, we've talked about truth, we've talked about guilt, we've talked about race. What's a biblical view on each one of those? Well, the biblical view on truth is simply this: truth exists and can be discovered. A while back, I was speaking on critical race theory in New York, and I had somebody afterwards come up and say, you said that critical race theory is based upon this idea that there's no absolute truth. He says, I've read some of the books, and I don't see that. I said, No, that's because the assumption when you open the book is relativism. The assumption when you walk into a college classroom, according to Alan Bloom and the closing of the American Mind, is what? That every student believes in relativism. You don't have to talk about that. That's the idea. The whole concept of critical race theory is there is no truth. Truth is basically what you white people say it is. Truth is actually what the winners of history say is true. No, the Bible tells us what is true, and it says that it exists and it can be discerned. Now, is there racial bias? Yes. Have there been people in the past that have used the Bible to justify slavery? Sadly so. If you go to the Probe website, I do an entire week of radio programs on slavery. Yes, sometimes that's the case. You might say, well, that's horrible. I can point to Christians today that use the Bible to justify abortion too, and I can find all sorts of examples of people that have misused the Bible, but usually what we find is it isn't so much racial bias as a problem as it is our biblical interpretation is flawed by sin. And more importantly, proponents of woke theology, they just reject any kind of rational arguments. Matter of fact, they want to censor contrary ideas. And, right now, have you noticed the number of people that are liberal being censored? I mean, I did not think that I would be quoting J.K. Rowling on the program, or Joe Rogan, or Bill Maher especially, and yet you're seeing the left is coming after the liberals, which, by the way, is a good principle I point out to some young people. You can never be woke enough. You just never can be. They are coming, they will eat their own. So to think that you can just be a little bit woke and keep your head down, you are wrong about that. And what we should be willing to do is to actually recognize that we are to love God with our minds. And 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5 talks about this 5, that we destroy arguments and speculations and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, because we need to do what? Take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So that's truth. What about race? Well, we see this as well. Critical race theory, I think, creates a real division between races. We see that Christ pulled down the division between Jews and Gentiles. He taught that there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male or female, for we're all one in Christ Jesus. And quite frankly, the proponents of critical race theory, they actually want to make you feel guilty about your race and instead say that you are an oppressor. And it's amazing. We'll sometimes tell these 5-year-olds that they're oppressors, and they're like, how does that fit? Which, of course, gets into the whole issue of guilt and grace. Because if you think about this, if you really follow it to its extension, critical race theory and this whole idea of the woke agenda and woke theology says that if you're a member of the oppressive race, and most of you are white, so we're talking to all of you here, indeed, you'll never be forgiven because you'll never be a different race. You're guilty by who you are. By contrast, the Bible does say that there is guilt, but it's due to what? Our sin. Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so it's not because of our racial status. And even more so, this idea of trying to follow critical race theory by trying to earn my own salvation, that goes against Ephesians 2:8-9, right? Because we're saved by what? Grace, not by works. And we're redeemed through Jesus Christ. Well, there's a lot more I can cover, but let me just mention real quickly that some of the books I have up here, in case you're interested, are some written books by, the first two are written by white Christians. The other two are written by black Christians. Aaron Strand's book, Christianity and Wokeness, I did an interview on Point of View. You can see that interview, and he's been up at University of North Texas doing some things, and up at Denton Bible Church and others. Noel Merring, Awake, Not Woke, very good book, a little more academic. Tony Evans' new book, I just mentioned a minute ago, Oneness Embraced, such a good book. You've got whole sections on what he would say to Christians who are white, what he would say to Christians that are black, how we can begin to really bring the church together. And his argument is the reason we're having a lot of these racial problems is because the church has failed, and I agree. So we're the church. Let's, humble ourselves and seek his face and let him heal our land, right? Does that make sense? And then, of course, Vadi Brockham and some others. A couple of booklets. I gave you one for free. And you might say, okay, but I want the others too. If you go to the Probe website right now, you can also get these as well as others. I've got my book on racism, and I give you some examples of racial stereotypes and everything. So you can download that one. Of course, you can download a digital copy of that one if you want to send it to someone. Download one on politicized culture. That gets into, kneeling in football games and that kind of stuff as well. And those books are there. Those booklets are there free of charge if you go to probe.org.